Hey everybody, I want to do a two-part lecture on some of the basics from Module 1 and Module 2 for this class that are going to be so foundational that they're relevant for the rest of the class. And honestly, the module content skips over this stuff really fast and gives you just the lowest level summaries. So I want to spend more time on this and show you how to actually critically think using ethical frameworks and to teach you the basics of how to do ethics or how we currently do ethics as philosophers in the 21st century, right? So let's just jump right into part one. In this video, I'm going to be talking mostly about how ethics is done, what an ethical theory is, how do you test an ethical theory. It's not like a scientific theory. You can't do experiments necessarily, or can you do experiments, right? So how is this done? So let's look at it. So first, let's just define ethics. There's an announcement in the class on this. There's a lot of different ways we could talk. As long as in a paper or in a discussion you stipulate your definition, you stipulate ahead of time what you mean by ethics or morality or values, whatever, it doesn't matter, right? So there's not just one right answer here. In terms of the course, and this is a pretty safe answer, it's just not the only definition you could use, but I think it's definitely on to something correct. Basically, everybody has what we would call morals, or everybody has an internal sense of morality. It's the rules, the principles, the ideals, the goals you have that you think are worth pursuing, the values of what's valuable, what is good, what is evil, what has value, how much value does it have, so how much should I care about it in relation to other things. You have those subjective private opinions, right? Those are subjective opinions. They might be true, they might be false, they might be partly true, who knows, but they're typically construed as opinions, subjective personal opinions. They could also be the opinions or the values or the morals of a culture, right? But basically what morals and values are in this course is we're talking about that subjective personal or cultural opinions. It's not necessarily true because cultures and individuals can get things wrong all the time, right? But ethics is simultaneously a discipline, right? It's a in the broad sense of a science, it's the science of morality, not in that we're trying to describe what people or cultures actually think. That's a job for psychologists and social scientists, right? We're trying to figure out, okay, is anybody's moral opinions actually correct and true? Are there objective morals out there and values that everybody should have? Is there any transcendent moral truths or values above just the individual opinions and feelings of people and societies and cultures, right? That's what ethics asks. And ethics is basically trying to figure out, can we discover or maybe construct ethical goals, principles, morals and values that go beyond just the individual, that we can all agree on and that have true authority over everybody, right? Some ethicists don't think that that's possible. They basically think there is no universal morality. It's all subjective. That would be a subjectivist opinion, or a relativist opinion. You could hear, or some people call it. You can also have a nihilist. There's different kinds of nihilism, but Friedrich Nietzsche is the best example. A nihilist will say there is no truth to morality at all. It's all completely subjective, and it doesn't really matter. Make up your own. That would be nihilism. But moral realists, another type of moral rationalists, think, no, there are ethical truths out there, or that we can construct, that are true, objective, transcendent, universally applicable, and authoritative. For instance, murder is always wrong. Sexual assault is always wrong. Slavery is always wrong. That would be kind of the common sense moral realist position. And there's a bunch of different theories about why that's true, what exactly morality is. But basically ethics is trying to figure out, are there any objective transcendent moral principles, or is it all just kind of subjective moral opinion and values? So I just want to make it clear that in the way the course talks, when we talk about morals and values, we're talking about the subjective stuff. When we're talking about ethics, we're at least talking about the effort and trying to see, is there anything beyond the purely subjective, right? So I hope that makes sense. Okay, so how do we actually do ethics? Because, you've got these questions. Do you just pull it out of your butt, right? You just make up ethical principles and rules and things to care about, goals to pursue, right? You just make them up. Did they evolve through evolution? Now we're just stuck with them. Well, there's a lot of different theories about how morality evolves, how ethics should be done, how if there is some sort of objective truth to morality that ethics can find, how we could best find that. There are a bunch of different theories and opinions on this. But in general, modern philosophy in the last 100 to 200 years works like this. Basically, we set out assuming that human beings have moral sensitivities, right? That we, at some level, whether that's biological or purely rational, again, there's different theories on this, there's not consensus, that we have the ability to kind of recognize when something's good and when something's bad at some level, right? And basically what that presumption says is that there are moral intuitions, our moral reactions and gut feelings to things can help us discover the truths about morality. At the very least, the truths about why we think and feel certain ways, right? So how most ethics works is you give someone a situation, whether it's a real or hypothetical one, and you see what their reaction is, including yourself. You think about a situation and you try to really get your mind around it, and you see, well, what's my gut reaction? You think about it some more and you look for these different moral intuitions that pop up. And yeah, they're basically moral reactions. Sometimes they're not reactions like you broke the rule. It's not that moral intuition is telling you what the rules are. It's typically much simpler. It's a moral intuition pops up and is like, that's a sad thing. That's a bad thing. That's a good thing. We should, and maybe even a thought, we should all care about this. We should all be angry. We should all be sad. We should all feel happy because of this. And you use those, what some people call sentimental responses, if you're like a Humean follower of David Hume. You use those moral intuitions and you reflect on those and see, okay, I have all these different moral intuitions. Is there anything they have in common? Is there any general principle maybe sitting in my subconscious mind that can explain why I feel this way? So for instance, we might have, it could be something as simple as you hold a newborn baby in your arms and that baby fills you with so much joy and happiness and love. And in that moment, your response is, everybody should feel this way. If you don't agree that this baby is so lovable and such a good thing, you're wrong, right? Or maybe it's just a simple intuition of you just feel that way, right? You feel that this baby is good, is lovable, is respectable, right? Another example, you see a dog limping, it's been hit by a car. A lot of us, our first reaction, our intuition is, oh, I have to help it, right? What? And you feel really sad and maybe anxious and you want to help the dog. Well, one thing to ask is, okay, we could just go with moral intuitions. We could just go with our gut, but they're very narrow and particular and specific, and they don't really tell us anything about general reality or why we think this way or what general rules we should be following. And we need some general structure to things. We can't just trust our gut every time because our gut leads us astray. But in the example of the baby and the dog, what do they have in common that might be triggering my sensitivity here? What is maybe what rule or principles or values are in the back of my mind that subconsciously push me to have these reactions, right? In the case of the newborn baby, it might be that you see something. Here's one theory, right? The baby and the dog are both cute, and cute things trigger us to want to protect them. And we want to protect them because we are both biologically and culturally predisposed to protect things that we find value in. So the baby and the dog, we both, the cuteness of them triggers a valuing response, so that we find these things valuable, and then, in the back of our minds, without even thinking about the value, we find those types of things, cute things, valuable and worthy of protection. So when you see one being hurt, your instinct kicks in to try to protect it. And when you see the baby and it's not hurt or anything, it's fine, your instinct also kicks in to value and love and cherish that thing. So that's one thing, one, just off the top of my head, hypothetical theory you could give is that, well, both dogs and babies are cute. And, what if the human psyche, the human soul, through cultural evolution and through biological evolution, basically there's a principle in the back of the mind that cute things are valuable and are worthy of love, and love involves protection and nurturing, right? So when we see a cute thing, whether it's in a good situation or bad situation, it triggers these different intuitions. One of them is a feeling of happiness. One of them a feeling is anxiety and that we should help it. They're different reactions or moral intuitions, but they both have a common cause, right? That we value and want to protect cute things. Okay, here's another theory. Another thing we could say is that as biological organisms, we have a fundamental drive to protect living things. It starts in ourselves. We want to protect our own life. And then it may be in evolutionary psychological history, it expands to altruism to our species, or those we consider in our in-group. So we want to protect our lives. We want to protect their lives. It's very plausible to think that all living beings cherish life, at least their own. So we have this drive to cherish life. Well, we're able to reflect, however this works, we're able to reflect that, well, this baby's one of us, not just one of us, but it's a living thing, right? So it clearly has value. And because it's one of us, well, it has even more value, right? Then we see the dog. The dog is also a living thing. And we could also say, well, dogs have been bred by humans for so long, we basically consider dogs like one of our kind, like they're in our social sphere. So maybe these two very different intuitions, again, one, you see a happy baby and you think this thing's so lovable, everybody should love it. The other one, you see an unhappy, injured dog and you get anxious and think, oh my God, this is so sad. Everybody should help it if they could. I should help it, right? But they might have, alternatively, there might be a principle in human psychology of all life is valuable, especially when it's in your in-group, however we want to define that. Your own species or a closely related species to human beings. And that produces those two intuitions. So you could see how drawing out, like investigating all these different specific intuitions through these different scenarios, called case studies or thought experiments, right? Those help us we're trying to figure out what's really behind them. Like they have these two very different intuitions. They have a common principle or core that they flow from. This is the same thing when we're doing math and especially logic too. I won't get too much into this. But basically what we're doing is we know that certain things are true, at least we presume they are. And we're trying to figure out, why are these two things true? Maybe there's a common explanation for it, right? If you want to know more about that, I'll tell you in a private conversation, but we're already at 14 minutes for this video. So that's how moral intuition works. Reflective equilibrium is basically a broad term for going through this process of intuitions, right? So it doesn't just have to be real scenarios. How you can try to figure out what your intuitions say in different situations is to do thought experiments, right? Oh, also called intuition pumps. And a thought experiment or intuition pump is a hypothetical or real scenario. In this class, we call them case studies that we reflect on and try to see what our moral intuitions say. And we do a bunch of those. And then we have all these intuitions and we see, do they make sense together? Again, like, are all these intuitions coherent? Are they in tension with each other? Is there some common cause or principle or explanation underlying them? Right? So that's really how modern ethics proceeds. I hope this makes sense. We draw out moral intuitions through experience, everyday experience, but also thought experiments or case studies, intuition pumps, all the same thing, different words for the same thing. We draw out our intuitions and reflect on them, and we try to see, do they have a common core? Which intuitions are trustworthy, which ones are not trustworthy? And then of the trustworthy ones, do they have a common core, a common principle or moral value that we can then say, oh, it seems like human beings have this underlying moral value that is very natural to us. And then there's the further assumption of, well, the moral values that we kind of have deep down like that, those may be actually correct and true. That's a big presupposition. It can be challenged in many ways. And there's also many ways to try to justify it, right? And that's where some of these frameworks come in that we'll talk about in the next lecture. But basically, we're setting out with a presumption we have certain sensitivities to morally relevant observations, events. By investigating when we're triggered, by investigating our responses, our moral intuitions, and trying to make them coherent, see which ones are good and reliable, which ones aren't, and then to investigate the underlying principles to see what's really behind them. We can, instead of just starting out from a bunch of assumptions, we can try to reconstruct the moral framework that is maybe, I keep going to the back of my head, that is underlying the human subconscious, and try to reconstruct it. Now, again, the problem with that is, well, what if different human beings have very different moral value systems and therefore very different moral intuitions, right? There's a lot of diversity from culture to culture. So, you have these problems, and we're not going to get through those in this course. That would take us really far afield into meta ethics, which asks those sort of fundamental questions. But that's generally how it's done, and that's how this class works. So overall, again, ethical theories, also called ethical frameworks, what they do is they try to help us make sense of all of these moral intuitions and to figure out how, what they all have in common, what underlying values and principles of them. And maybe if we could figure out those general, deeper, psychologically and logically deeper moral principles, then we could see, oh, yes, who could disagree with that? For instance, maybe a bunch of people, maybe a bunch of cultures disagree about the value of animal life, or even we all agree that life is valuable, but maybe we have a different hierarchy. Dogs are above monkeys in one culture, monkeys are above dogs in another culture, right? But maybe there's some core common principles that if we studied our intuitions enough, we could find that there are actually some core principles that all human beings agree with, that kind of transcend the cultures. And then we have to ask, are those true? Are those fundamental universal human values actually true? For instance, I'm of the opinion that all human beings value life, value existence, even people who, commit suicide, sadly, or who kill other people. At the very least, they value their own life and own existence, and most of the time with suicide, sensitive topic, but the person who commits suicide, it's not that they don't want to live, it's that living is painful, and they're hoping to escape, right? all human beings dislike pain and suffering. People who do like pain, it's because it's not really, at least it seems to me, it's not really pain, right? It's being experienced as a sort of pleasure, even if it's indirect. But if you don't take pleasure from pain, physical pain, right? If you experience physical pain as mental anguish or suffering, everybody agrees that mental anguish and suffering suck, right? There are certain things that seem to me to be universal. All cultures, for instance, value human life. All cultures value their offspring. All cultures value. This one's amazing because we tend to not think like this. All cultures, all human cultures, are artistic. They value art. They value beauty. They value aesthetic value. And even pre-human, like Neanderthals, there's evidence that they had like cave art and stuff, and early humans have cave art. So it seems that like those sorts of things in general are values that we all share, universal. And I think beauty and art are a great example because it shows you different cultures have very different standards of beauty. They have very different ideas and styles, but they all care about art and beauty. And if we don't have a bunch of biases, we could go to different cultures and we're like, wow, that's really beautiful how they designed their cities or buildings or their paintings or poetry, right? It's very rare that you ever find a culture that actually produces nothing beautiful. So that sort of thing gives people hope, that gives philosophers hope that, well, there's a bunch of different manifestations of how human beings, you know, how they how they make beautiful things, right? But they all care about beauty, and for the most part, the beautiful things they do make, we all agree that they're beautiful. Like, I love Japanese art. I love Western European art. I love Eastern European art. I love African art. I've never found a culture with nothing beautiful in it. And so that's a sort of universal value that's like, well, it's not all subjective then. Not completely, at least. Human beings all value beauty, and we all value similar kinds of beauty once we learn how to see and understand different cultures. It's just different styles. The same thing might be true with morality too, right? This is the idea, is that yeah, we might have very different moral values and intuitions. We might even differ on some of our moral principles. But maybe deep down we all care about the same thing, and it's just different manifestations of that same core. For instance, every human society until very recently has been religious, has had some sort of supernatural bent, some respect for God or the gods, some awareness of a spiritual reality, even if there's very different manifestations. And there's a lot, especially if you look at theistic religions, East and West, throughout written history. There's a lot they have in common. There's some core truths they have in common, but a lot of different cultural expressions. Again, back to ethics or morality and values, it might be that everyone wants to be happy. Everyone wants to be happy. Everyone wants to be healthy. Everybody wants to be a good human being in terms of fully functioning. Everybody wants to have pleasure. Everybody values these things. Everybody values life and existence. But there's different when you also add in artistic value and religious values and spiritual values and these other mythological layers to things. Those core unified intuitions, those core unified values we might all share, can branch off into a bunch of different manifestations. And that's one theory. Maybe we really do. There is a universal natural law, right? That sometimes you hear it called natural law theory. Maybe there's a real natural law that we all share, but it's very simple and deep down, and there's a lot of things growing, a lot of diversity growing out of it, right? A lot of different ways to try to live up to it. Okay, so I want to talk. I'll talk about this more in the next video, but just really briefly, how to succeed in this class, taking all of this into account. Basically, what this class is doing is it's going to give you a bunch of thought experiments, a bunch of intuition pumps or case studies, and it's going to ask you to analyze them. One, draw out your moral intuitions, your gut reactions, and describe them. Two, try to figure out what do these things have in common. Is there some moral principle or value underlying them that you can then apply? Try to figure what that is when you read these case studies, right? Like I just described. Three, having, before any of you were born, some of us were doing this. And before I was born, it's been, a couple thousand years, people have been doing this sort of ethics. There are already a bunch of mainstream philosophical theories about the values we really have or should have, the deep down fundamental values that give rise to all the intuitions. And I'll cover those in the next video. Those are ethical, mainstream or major ethical theories or frameworks. When you use an ethical framework, you're basically saying, at least for the sake of argument, I'm going to assume this framework is correct. And that framework basically says, here's how to decide on certain moral issues. Here's the important things to care about. Here's their ranking of value or goodness or evil or whatever. And here's the relevant features of the problem or the decision to look for. They give you, in other words, a decision criteria. They tell you what to look for when you're making a decision. And these have been partly constructed by looking at our moral feelings and intuitions and trying to extrapolate a general theory from them, right? So when in our writing assignments, when we do this, when we try to figure out, when we try to actually analyze the situation, we don't want to just use our gut feelings. Those are unreliable. We want to try to get from the intuition or gut feeling to general principles. And then we want to also be consulting these established frameworks and see, do the general principles I'm coming at or I have within me, do those line up with this framework? What does the framework say? Does the framework reach the same conclusion as me, but for different reasons, right? If I basically put on the glasses of these frameworks and work through them and analyze the problem through them, what decision has to be made? What values fall out of that for this, case study? So I'm going to talk more about that in the next video, but I want you to try to keep all of this in mind in your writing assignments. We're at 27 minutes. That's kind of long, but I'm going to stop here and I'll make the second part shortly after. Bye, everybody.